Okay, so you want to sell water. Not oil, not smartphones, not luxury watches. Water. Something that literally falls from the sky, comes out of the ground, and in most developed countries is already available from a tap for almost nothing. So you put that same water inside a plastic bottle, put a label on it, drive it across the country, put it inside a refrigerator, and suddenly people are willing to pay $1, $2, sometimes even $5 for it. And here's the strange part. The water itself can be one of the cheapest parts of the entire product. So where does all the money go? Because bottled water looks like one of the simplest businesses on earth. Fill bottle. Put cap on. Sell bottle. But behind that simple bottle is a surprisingly complicated economic machine involving plastic, factories, trucks, supermarkets, advertising, refrigeration, water sources, recycling, and something even more valuable than water itself: convenience. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how the bottled water business makes money, what a typical bottle can actually cost to produce and distribute, why a $1 bottle doesn't mean the company made 70 or 80 cents, how companies like Coca-Cola and PepsiCo built enormous beverage businesses around products that are mostly water, and why the economics of bottled water may be changing. Let's start with the most uncomfortable question. How much is the water actually worth? Imagine you walk into a supermarket in the United States and buy a standard 16.9-ounce bottle of water. That's roughly half a liter. You might pay around $1, maybe $1.50. At a convenience store, airport, stadium, or hotel, you could easily pay several times more. Now imagine somebody offers you the same amount of tap water. You probably wouldn't pay $1. You might not even pay a cent. And that's because the raw water itself is usually not where most of the economic value is created. The value comes from everything surrounding it. The bottle, the cap, the label, the purification, the factory, the transportation, the warehouse, the shelf space, the refrigeration, the marketing, and most importantly, the fact that the water is already sitting in your hand exactly when you want it. Think about the last time you bought bottled water. Maybe you were driving. Maybe you were at an airport. Maybe you were at the gym. Maybe it was 95 degrees outside and you were thirsty. At that moment, you weren't really buying water. You were buying convenience. And convenience is one of the most profitable things a company can sell. This is why bottled water became such an enormous global industry. In the United States alone, consumers drink billions of gallons of bottled water every year, and bottled water has become one of the largest packaged beverage categories by volume. But here's where the economics gets interesting. Because if you're a giant beverage company, you're not thinking about one bottle. You're thinking about hundreds of millions or even billions of units. And once you operate at that scale, tiny differences in cost become enormous amounts of money. So let's build the business from the ground up. Imagine you want to launch your own bottled water company. Your first problem is not finding water. Your first problem is finding a reliable source. Depending on the product and local regulations, you might use a municipal supply, groundwater, a spring, or another approved source. Then you have to treat it. The water may be filtered. It may go through reverse osmosis. It may be disinfected using ultraviolet light or ozone. The exact process depends on the source and the type of bottled water you're producing. And then comes the bottle. This is where something interesting happens. The bottle that looks like the product is actually part of the manufacturing system. Most single-use plastic water bottles are made primarily from PET, or polyethylene terephthalate. Instead of shipping millions of empty bottles around the country, many large bottling plants manufacture bottles on-site. They start with small plastic pieces called preforms. These look almost like tiny test tubes. The factory heats them, places them into molds, and stretches them using high-pressure air. A few seconds later, that tiny preform has become a full-sized bottle. It's fast. It's automated. And when you're producing millions of bottles, automation is everything. Because the economics of bottled water depend heavily on volume. Now, let's stop talking about the business in generalities and put one actual bottle on the table. Take a standard 16, 9-ounce, or roughly 500 milliliter bottle of purified water. Imagine it eventually sells to a consumer for $1. That dollar doesn't go straight back to the water company. And here's a realistic way to think about where the money goes. The water itself can cost less than a cent per bottle once you look at the actual volume involved, although treatment and processing add additional costs. The plastic bottle and cap are much more significant. Depending on the weight of the bottle, recycled content, resin prices, and manufacturing efficiency, let's use roughly 6 cents as an illustrative figure for the bottle and cap. Then there's the label, maybe another 2 cents. Filling, filtration, electricity, factory labor, quality control, and equipment overhead could add roughly another 4 cents. Then you need secondary packaging, cardboard cases, shrink wrap, pallets, and other materials. Let's allocate around 3 cents per bottle. And then there's transportation and distribution. This is one of the costs people forget. Let's say another 5 cents per bottle in a reasonably efficient supply chain. Add those numbers together, and you're looking at approximately 20 cents per bottle in this simplified example. But I want to make something very clear. This is an illustrative industry model, not a universal published cost. A giant bottling plant, using lightweight bottles and efficient logistics, could produce at a lower cost. A smaller company, expensive market, heavier packaging, higher plastic prices, or longer delivery distance could be significantly more expensive. That's important because bottled water economics can vary enormously depending on scale and location. Now here's where things get interesting. Suppose our bottle costs roughly 20 cents to manufacture and distribute. You don't necessarily sell it directly to the consumer. Instead, you sell it into a retail system. Let's imagine the manufacturer receives about 45 cents for that bottle. The retailer then sells it for around $1. That means the manufacturer has roughly 25 cents between its selling price and the simplified manufacturing and distribution cost. But don't call that 25 cents profit yet, because this is where people make one of the biggest mistakes when looking at consumer products. Gross margin is not the same thing as net profit. The company still has to pay for advertising, corporate employees, warehouses, insurance, equipment, depreciation, financing, taxes, research, sales teams, and all the other costs required to operate the company. So if you're looking at a $1 bottle and thinking, this company must be making 80 cents, you're missing most of the business. But now, multiply the economics. One bottle isn't exciting. 1 million bottles is different. If your simplified gross contribution were 25 cents per bottle, 1 million bottles would represent $250,000 before additional corporate and operating expenses. 10 million bottles? $2, 5 millions. And a major beverage company isn't thinking in millions. It's thinking in hundreds of millions and billions. That's the magic of consumer packaged goods. Tiny economics repeated at enormous scale can become enormous businesses. And bottled water is almost the perfect product for this model. People don't need instructions. They don't need an app. They don't need a sales representative. They see the bottle. They're thirsty. They buy it. But there's another economic trick happening here. Branding. Because technically, water is water. Yet, consumers don't treat all water as identical. A bottle from a discount supermarket doesn't necessarily feel the same as a premium imported mineral water brand. The difference isn't always the liquid. It's the story, the source, the packaging, the design, the reputation, and sometimes the perception that the water is healthier, purer, cleaner, more natural, or more sophisticated. This is why premium bottled water can sell for dramatically higher prices than ordinary bottled water. You're no longer competing purely on the cost of the liquid. You're competing on perceived value. It's the same reason people pay several dollars for coffee, when the raw coffee beans represent only a small part of the final price. The product isn't just the ingredient, it's the entire experience surrounding the ingredient. And bottled water companies learn this lesson extremely well. But there's an even bigger player in the economics. Convenience stores. Think about where bottled water becomes expensive. An airport, a hotel, a gas station, a stadium, a vending machine. Why? Because you're paying for location value. You're not standing in your kitchen. You're standing somewhere where your alternatives are limited. The bottle might cost only a little more to distribute, but your willingness to pay can increase dramatically because you're thirsty right now. This is why the same basic product can have completely different prices depending on where you buy it. The water didn't change. The economics did. Now let's talk about the biggest physical input most consumers never think about. Plastic. PET is relatively lightweight and extremely useful for beverage packaging, but producing it requires petrochemical feedstocks, and the cost of those materials can fluctuate with energy and commodity markets. So when input costs rise, packaging economics change. And bottled water companies have another problem. They're selling a disposable package. Once you drink the water, the bottle has to go somewhere. This creates environmental costs and regulatory pressure that weren't nearly as important to the business decades ago. Governments and consumers are increasingly focused on plastic waste, recycling rates, packaging reduction, and extended producer responsibility. And that creates a strange economic paradox. The bottle is one of the reasons bottled water is convenient. But the bottle is also one of the industry's biggest liabilities. Companies are therefore experimenting with lighter bottles, recycled PET, larger refillable formats, and alternative packaging. And here's where economics becomes surprisingly powerful. Suppose a company sells 1 billion bottles. If engineers can remove just 1 gram of plastic from every bottle, that's 1 billion grams. Or 1 million kilograms of plastic. One small design change has now eliminated roughly 1,000 metric tons of material across the entire production run. And there's another potential benefit. Less material can also mean less weight moving through the supply chain. That can reduce transportation costs as well. So saving 1 gram doesn't sound exciting, but across 1 billion bottles, it becomes a serious financial decision. This is the power of scale. Now, consider transportation. Water is heavy, very heavy. 1 liter of water weighs approximately 1 kilogram before you even count the bottle. That means when you're transporting bottled water, you're paying trucks to move enormous amounts of weight that have relatively little value per kilogram. Imagine a truck carrying tens of thousands of bottles. The truck costs money. The driver costs money. Fuel costs money. Insurance costs money. Warehouse space costs money. And every additional mile between the factory and the customer adds another expense. This is why bottled water is fundamentally a logistics business. A company could make the cheapest bottle of water in the world, but if it has to transport that bottle hundreds or thousands of miles before selling it, the economics can become terrible. This is also why bottled water companies often benefit from having production facilities close to major markets. Shorter transportation distances mean lower costs. And this is one reason scale creates such a powerful competitive advantage. A giant beverage company can operate multiple plants, negotiate large packaging contracts, optimize distribution routes, and use enormous purchasing power. A small startup doesn't have those advantages. It might make a great bottle of water, but getting that bottle into thousands of stores is another story. The supermarket doesn't just need to like your product. It needs to believe customers will buy it. The distributor needs to carry it. The factory needs to produce it cheaply enough, and the retailer needs enough margin to care. That's the real business. Not water. Infrastructure, distribution, scale, and consumer behavior. But bottled water also faces a competitor that doesn't have a marketing department. Top water. In many developed markets, Municipal tap water is dramatically cheaper per liter than bottled water, and increasingly, consumers know that. So bottled water companies have to answer a basic question. Why should someone pay for something they can get almost free? The answer has always been a combination of convenience, portability, taste, trust, and branding. But now, technology is changing that equation. Water filters are becoming cheaper. Reusable bottles are everywhere. Refill stations are expanding. And consumers are becoming more conscious about waste. That doesn't mean bottled water is disappearing. Far from it. Because convenience is incredibly difficult to eliminate. If you're hiking through a desert, you don't care that the water in your kitchen is cheaper. If you're on a plane, you don't have access to your kitchen. If you're leaving a gym, you might want something immediately. Bottled water wins because it solves a problem at exactly the moment the consumer experiences it. And that brings us to perhaps the most important lesson in this entire business. The bottled water industry doesn't really sell water. It sells access. It sells portability. It sells reliability. It sells convenience. And sometimes, it sells status. That's why a substance worth very little at the source can become a multi-billion-dollar consumer industry by the time it reaches a refrigerator in a convenience store. Now, imagine you're running the company. You have a factory producing millions of bottles. Your machines run continuously. Every minute, more bottles come off the production line. The water flows in. The plastic becomes bottles. Labels are applied. Cases are packed. Pallets are stacked. Trucks arrive. And then those trucks disappear onto highways across the country. Your profit isn't hiding inside the bottle. It's hiding in the system. Every saved cent on plastic. Every optimized truck route. Every efficient factory. Every additional bottle sold. Every better retail contract. Every percentage point of market share. That's where the money is. And this explains why giant beverage companies can compete so aggressively in what looks like an incredibly simple category. Once you have distribution, factories, brand recognition, retailer relationships, and massive purchasing power, your economics become extremely difficult for a small competitor to replicate. And this is why the bottled water business is such a good example of a much bigger economic principle. The cheapest ingredient doesn't necessarily mean the cheapest product. The raw water can be nearly worthless. But turning that water into something clean, portable, branded, packaged, distributed, refrigerated, and available exactly when a consumer wants, it creates an entirely different product. So let's return to that bottle sitting in front of you. Maybe you paid $1. Inside is about half a liter of water. The raw liquid may represent only a tiny fraction of the final price. The rest is the invisible economy surrounding it. Plastic, labor, energy, treatment, packaging, transportation, warehousing, retail, marketing, taxes, and profit. And that is why bottled water is such a fascinating business, because it demonstrates one of the most important ideas in economics. A product's price is not determined simply by what the product is worth as a raw material. It's determined by what people are willing to pay for the entire package. Water may be cheap, but clean, portable, trusted water, available exactly when you're thirsty, that's a different product. And once you understand that, you start seeing bottled water everywhere differently. The bottle in the gym, the bottle at the airport, the case sitting inside a supermarket, the premium bottle at a hotel. They're all selling essentially the same fundamental resource. But each one has a completely different economic story. And perhaps that's the strangest thing about bottled water. Human civilization spent thousands of years figuring out how to bring clean water directly into people's homes. Then we built an enormous industry convincing people to buy it back in a bottle. And somehow, it works. Not because water is rare, not because plastic is valuable, and not because the liquid itself is expensive. It works because when you're thirsty, convenience has a price. And that price is where the bottled water business makes its money.